introduce our next session today.
Thanks, Chelsea. We've got a great panel lined up today to hear even more about funding and policy priorities. We have speakers across a range of different agencies at the state and national level. So first, we're going to hear a brief introduction from each panelist. And then after they've all had a chance to speak, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So our panelists today are going to be Stash Burgiel from the National Invasive Species Council, Dave Anderson from the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, Vanessa Lopez from the U.S. Forest Service, and Todd Cease from the National Park Service. So first up, we have Stash. Stash, do you want to say a few words?
Sure, and I'd like to first start by thanking you and the other organizers for inviting me to participate on this panel. And I think that the last discussion under following on the Q&A with Elizabeth's presentation is a nice sort of intro in terms of some of the broader considerations around policy and funding issues. And I'm just going to talk to sort of four specific issues. First, in terms of really sort of setting the stage for federal agencies, there is Executive Order 14008, which came out in January of 2021, right after the Biden administration sort of came into play, and that was on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And it really goes into, as you would expect, sort of the broad sort of implications in terms of addressing climate change, from climate pollution to resilience to public health to conserving lands and waters and biodiversity. And really, you can sort of find invasive species in most of those aspects. And while the executive order doesn't address invasive species itself, I think it really kind of creates the framework for which agencies are now moving forward in terms of thinking about land and natural resource management in general. It does talk about the development of action plans by agencies, the 30 by 30 approach, so conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030, and sort of conservation really relies on sort of protection and management, so that incorporates invasive species, as well as the idea of the civilian climate corps and really sort of getting boots on the ground to do some of the management work. So I think that kind of sets the overall tone in terms of how agencies are moving forward and looking to sort of mainstream climate into other areas and sort of mainstream those areas like invasive species into climate change. And I think it's a two-way street. The second area or bucket I wanted to touch on is that sort of the congressional interest. There was some discussion around the infrastructure law. And sort of back when that was passed, there was also the Build Back Better law. So the infrastructure law was obviously looking at infrastructure and jobs, and Build Back Better was going to do the energy and climate component of things. There are still, the Build Back Better didn't sort of ultimately pass. There are still discussions around that. But I think, with the infrastructure law, the funding that's specific to invasive species under restoration, a lot of the other restoration activities, in addition to invasive species, as well as the funding that's going to some of the wildland fire, all offer opportunities in terms of invasive species. And I know that there are some agencies which didn't get specific line items for invasive species that are looking at the restoration funds and how those could be integrated with their invasive species work. So I think even without the Build Back Better and this funds specifically designated for climate change, I think the agencies are incorporating those ideas, and they certainly have their hands full in terms of how that funding will get rolled out over the next 5 years. The third bucket I wanted to touch on really sort of moves to that department level. And I think in some senses, there's a little bit of catch up, and over the past 4 years and beyond, certainly beyond that, there's been a lot of work at the programmatic level in terms of responding to climate change, the tools, the information, the science. And now with the charge to develop climate action plans and sort of have department level approaches, there's a need to I think sort of at a department level, think about how those ideas are going to be scaled up and what kinds of strategies and approaches will be used, particularly in the, for us in the invasive species sphere. So thinking about how the agencies are rolling out their climate action plans, their climate adaptation resilience plans, that's really where we need to sort of think through the nexus on what are the concrete sort of touch points with invasive species. And there we can think about some of the frameworks that have been developed, the RAD, resist, accept, direct, the resistance, resilience approaches, transformation approaches, and sort of unifying frameworks in that sense. And I think there might also be some areas where There needs to be discussion. We may not be able to harmonize approaches across agencies, but at least be able to understand them. So assisted migration, or how we deal with neonatives, so native species that are sort of moving beyond their traditional borders and causing impact. And different agencies might have different missions and sort of different ways that legally they can address or not address those species. And I think we need to have a better understanding in that area as well. And then finally, I just want to touch briefly on the work of the National Invasive Species Council. So in our FY22 work plan, for the first time, we've got climate change written into it, even though it was specifically called out in the 2016 executive order. So that's exciting. But we know that there's a lot of work going on. There's a lot of work going on with the risks in federal agencies. So our first task is really to scope the landscape and figure out from an interagency perspective, where is the value added that we can provide. And so we're interested in events like this and having discussions both with non-federal partners as well as our federal agencies to figure out where we can help sort of leverage and move the ball forward. And even when we look at the other activities in our work plan, like wild and fire, early detection, rapid response, information management, it's easy to see connections to climate in all of those. And so those are other areas that we're thinking for. I'll just also note that, from a departmental perspective, we do have colleagues from Park Service as well as Forest Service. So I'm presuming that they can provide sort of more details in terms of how this is getting sort of laid out in their particular agencies. So thank you.
Thanks, Dash. Next, we will hear from Dave Anderson with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program.
Hi. Thanks, Wynn. I'm really glad to be here and to have this opportunity to connect with the RISC and think about noxious weeds in the context of the species conservation, species and ecosystem conservation work that we support at our program at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. We're a, let's see.
Dave, we can see your presenter view right now, so you may want to switch screens.
Oh, weird. Oh, you have...
That's on me. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to tell you a brief bit about us. We're a program based at Colorado State University, and we're also Colorado's constituent member of the NatureServe Network. So in this panel, thinking about funding priorities and policies, I think the RISC has identified some really nice key questions for funding priorities on your website. That's going to be my third slide there. If you guys want to advance it, I do not have the ability to control them. These are great questions. They're things that we've been trying to address in part here in our work, but haven't focused as much on the invasive species component. I think as an emerging partnership, that's a humongous opportunity for us to work together. And so the most threatened systems in the western half of the north central region are, I would argue that they're the pinyon juniper and the sagebrush systems. And that's really where I think the issues of fire, weeds, and climate come together. And I wouldn't be surprised if you all have already talked at length about these. We've done some climate projection models of pinyon juniper in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, and they show lots of areas that are threatened through across a different variety of climate scenarios. This is work that we did with the CASC back when Jeff was the director of that center. And one species we've been focusing on a lot lately is the pinyon jay, which is really emerging as something to be concerned about now, as these systems, as the pinyon juniper system increases in level of threats that it's facing. And so I was also going to mention the data that we're kind of developing to help support decision making here. And so those include the element occurrence data that the NatureServe Network programs throughout the RISC or through the North Central region share with agencies to support conservation. Done a lot of models at the state level here in Colorado, and there's also some continental models for biodiversity conservation. Most prominently, I'm thinking of the MOBI, the map of biodiversity importance developed by the NatureServe network, and using data from our programs to generate it. And I'm thinking about the climate models that we've developed with the CASC and BLM that help us understand areas of transformation where managers are going to be needing to focus on the current metastable systems and thinking about transformation and climate smart restoration and management to help support that. And the alliances that we've worked on in this thus far have included kind of a nice suite of federal agencies: BLM, Forest Service, and Park Service, and USGS has been prominent. Also, orgs including NatureServe, heritage programs, and the Nature Conservancy, and the state wildlife agencies and tribes at those scales make nice collaborations to work on this. Chelsea asked me to say a thing or two about big funding things coming up. I think Stas knows a lot more about those than I do. Maybe let's go ahead and advance just to that SWAP slide. I'll mention the SWAP. So these are coming up in all of the states in the North Central region for being revised in 2025. States are getting to work on that now. Colorado's going to start working on it within the next year or so. And the new SWAPs are going to be, they're still going to be a guiding document for action on the T&E species, threatened species, and the species of greatest conservation need. And they're going to be looking at these not as a static plan that sits on a shelf, but as a dynamic document. They're going to have some more interactive presence on the web somehow. CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, is creating some pretty nifty stuff. They've created these conservation dashboards to make it easier to measure progress and improve the efficiency of the data access for them. And so it's a very cooperative effort, and I think the folks on this meeting will be really appropriate with CPW to develop the 2025 SWAP. So it's going to be a much more accessible and dynamic, and these have a required climate vulnerability assessment component. So maybe I'll just leave it at that, and the next panelists introduce themselves. Thank you so much. I think I also forgot to say I'm the director at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program.
Thanks, Dave. We'll turn it over to Vanessa Lopez from U.S. Forest Service.
Mute. Hi, everyone. I'm Vanessa Lopez. I am the Invasive Plants and Biological Control National Program Manager for the Forest Service. So just continuing with our wonderful panelists and what they've been talking about, the Forest Service definitely understands and appreciates the critical role that invasive species and climate change plays on the work that we do across our forests and grasslands. So continuing to increase our knowledge on climate change and invasive species impacts, and working on ways to mitigate their negative effects is definitely a priority for the Forest Service. Right now, we are working on developing a climate adaptation plan, and that provides an overview of the top risks of climate change impacts to the agency's mission and operations. And it identifies key adaptation actions for addressing these risks over the next several years. So that's one of the things that we've been active on the climate change front. Also for invasive species, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, the bipartisan infrastructure law has allocated $100 million for invasive species work to the Forest Service, and that is to go to work on federal and non-federal lands. So right now we have been working with our partners across state and private lands, as well as within our own shop across the national forest systems, to identify priorities and mechanisms for distributing this money to make sure that we get good work done on the ground and help to move that needle for helping to improve the impacts of invasive species across our lands. So for those of you who aren't too familiar with the way the Forest Service, the breakdown of our agency, basically our agency is broken down into three main components that focuses on invasive species and climate change. One of them is our research and development arm, which focuses on improving our understanding, our knowledge on invasive species and climate change. And they also help to develop technologies and improve methodologies for helping to detect, prevent, and manage these issues across the landscape. We also have our National Forest Systems branch, or a component of our agency, and they're focused on prevention management across our national forest system lands. Finally, we have our state and private forestry arm, and that is actually where I sit under state and private forestry, and we work across state and private boundaries, state and private lands, to also help to detect, prevent, and manage for invasive species and climate change impacts across those landscapes. So I mentioned that I am under state and private forestry. My office is actually Forest Health Protection. And within Forest Health Protection, we have several programs that focus on invasive species. And really, climate change is something that enters all aspects of our work in forest management and forest health. So I manage, as I mentioned earlier, I manage the invasive plants program, also biocontrol program. And the goal of the invasive plants program is to provide technical assistance and to facilitate management and restoration of lands that have been impacted by invasive plants. And over the past year or two, we've been working on identifying priorities for the program. And one of these programs is focusing on addressing the intersection of invasive plant management and climate change impacts by assisting in the development of science, management, and communication. So those are just some of the things that we're working on here at the Forest Service to address invasive species and climate change. So thank you for the opportunity to sit on the panel. I'll go ahead and pass it to the next person.
Thanks so much. Okay, last up, we have Todd Cease from the National Park Service.
Morning, everyone. I'm Todd Cease, as you heard, with the National Park Service. So let me first start and give you an organizational structure of the Park Service and where I'm sitting. So my role is in the Washington office, and I'm with what we call our Biological Resources Division. And where that sits is within the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Directorate. And along with Biological Resources Division, or BRD, we also have our Climate Change Response Program. So to hit that relationship right off the bat here is that our Climate Change Response Program provides information not only to Natural Resource Stewardship and Science, NRSS, but also to all the parks. So that is our connection between the climate change science and information that's going on out there to the actual on the ground work that's going on. I like to think about climate change much like we think about safety in the workplace. If we think of safety separate from how we do our work, we're bound to have some safety issues. If we think about safety as an integrated approach to how we do our work so that we don't even think about it, we just do it. We work safely, we drive safely, It's in our systems, then we're actually having a pretty darn good safety program. Now let's put that into the climate change scenario. If we have to stop and think about climate change versus it being integrated in all of our thoughts, then we have kind of a clunky system going on. So the goal is that instead of saying, oh, here's our problem, here's how we think we deal with that, and then bring climate change into it, we just are integrating that right in with the very beginning. So it isn't something we think about, it's something that we just do naturally, organically. So to me, that's the goal of how to integrate climate change into all of the decisions and actions that we do. All right, so what does BRD do for invasive species in the National Park Service? As I say, we're a headquarters office. We're actually located in Fort Collins. And what we do is we provide technical support to the more than 400 park units in the National Park Service or system. So what does that mean? Well, for starters, we have invasive plant management teams. We have 17 teams across the country dealing with invasive species at nearly 300 parks. So what these are technical experts in the field working alongside park staff to deal with invasive species. That would be control, prevention, early detection, all of the things that we're all so familiar with. So how we try to align our goals across the Park Service, because there's a lot of units out there, and we're pretty much a decentralized unit or system. A lot of parks are doing quite a lot of really good things. We provide that technical expertise to try to align all the actions that we're doing so that we're not 400 and some individual units, but we're a collective bunch of parks moving forward in the same direction. That's what our IPMT teams do help in doing. For just to give you an idea of how much monies that are going into this is close to $9 million a year, both in leveraged funds and Park Service funds are going into these IPMTs. And they've been around for over 20 years. Very effective SWAT team type approach. At the Washington office, and one of my roles that I do is I sit on what we call the DOI Task Force for Invasive Species. So that's a Department of Interior, multiple bureau group that meets once a month and discusses how we're approaching invasive species in a collaborative manner across the Department of Interior. And you heard Staffs talk about NISC and their work plans. One of the tasks that we have on the DOI Task Force for Invasive Species is to provide input on what their work plan is, what they're going to be doing in their annual work plans. So it's that collaborative effort, so that just like at the park levels, we are trying to be cohesive and collaborative. Also at the department level, we're trying to talk across bureaus so that we all aren't kind of pulling in different directions. Some of the initiatives that we're moving forward on, and most importantly, I think you all know of EDRR, Early Detection Rapid Response. That early detection, as we've been learning, is really that key. Jump on it early before that invasive species, whether it be plant or animal, moves into harder to control, more expensive to control part. So that's the big focus right now is EDRR. So if we can get on it quick, prevent, and we all can have a better time of dealing with invasive species. Heard a little bit of discussions this morning about Bill, or as we call it, Bill, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Bill is bringing a lot of money and starting a lot of conversations about how can we, in the federal government, through the uses of contracts, working with states, working with private landowners, make a dent in invasive species. Lots of money being put towards it. So right now, we currently, through the work of the DOI Task Force, are putting together bureau plans. Bureaus are submitting projects, and we're in that stage of where are we going to put the money that's coming through. Now, the bill is 5 years, millions of dollars over 5 years to be put into multiple things. Well, I should say billions put into multiple things, but millions into invasive species. So we're very excited about that opportunity and hope that we can put a dent in the invasive species issues. I guess I'll just conclude with saying that invasive species is definitely a high priority for us. And through collaborative work, not only with other bureaus, but with the Climate Change Response Program, with all the parks that we have, all the regions that we have, that's really how we're going to make a difference on invasive species. You know, we talk a little bit about policy. Sometimes policy gets a little boring for folks, but what does policy really do for us? Policy helps us align our actions. Policy gives us a little bit of that foundation so that we can stand on together and be pointing in the right direction. So it really is that directional piece. So whether you like policy or you don't like policy, there is something that it can do for us, and it can result in some good actions. So look forward to any questions you might have, and thank you so much for having me on the panel.
Thank you, Todd, and thanks to all of our panelists. We are now going to open it up to questions from the audience. We have a little less than 15 minutes for a discussion. So if folks want to raise their hand or put questions into the chat, you can either direct your questions towards a particular speaker, or you can open it up to the entire group. And thanks again to all our panelists. We have Stash Burgiel from the National Invasive Species Council. We have Dave Anderson from the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, Vanessa Lopez from the U.S. Forest Service, and Todd Cease from the National Park Service. I guess I have a question for Todd first. I know that the CCRP and National Park Service in general is interested in the idea of RAD decision making. Can you talk a little bit about how that has trickled into decision making about invasive species in particular?
Yeah, I can do that. So RAD, our CCRP group was definitely instrumental in very involved in that. And to start with, education, what is RAD all about? So getting the word out, and CCRP, I think, is doing a real good job in that. And providing a range of tools to help parks making decisions and those impacts. One of the things that we're moving towards is scenario planning. And I think in that scenario planning situation, as we're relating it to invasive species, really talking about putting actions on the ground and then thinking the way we used to in the past, like, well, if we remove this invasive species, well, obviously the native plants will come back. But I think that RAD framework really stops and has us looking in a strategic manner. How are the conditions changing? What is that scenario? What are the different scenarios that we could possibly come up with that because of the warmer or less precipitation or more intensive storms, what kind of shifts are we going to see in plants? What might we see that we didn't anticipate 10 years ago? And is that a range expansion of a native species? And how do we deal with that? So I think that's really how that RAD framework can help us put some boundaries around those scenarios that we are seeing and start us thinking in a different way than how we have in the past. That is, we do an action and we have a pretty predictable outcome. The issue now is that action may not have that same predictable outcome that we've had in the future, in the past, excuse me, and how do we set that frame to think about what actions, how we change our actions so that we can adapt to that.
Thanks, Todd. Any other questions for our panelists? I think I see that Elizabeth, you have your hand raised. You can go ahead.
Yeah, this is a question, I guess, mostly directed at Vanessa, but obviously anybody can answer it as well. Something I think that's on a lot of people's minds is, you know, when you have limited funding, how can you maximize the resources that are available to address both invasive species and climate change? And I think that would be a really great, if you just have any ideas about that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, that's a really important question. The funding is never enough. You know, these problems are so huge that we really have to think strategically when we come up with ways to allocate and the priorities that we focus on for invasive species and climate change. And I know that right now with the bipartisan infrastructure law funds for invasive species, we've been really thinking a lot about what you just asked. You know, how can we maximize the work that we do with the limited funding? And, you know, $100 million, it sounds like a ton of money, but when you break it down across the country, it really only scratches the surface at what needs to get done. And so I think it really comes down to communication and working with partners to be transparent with priorities and to kind of continue talking and continue the dialogue and see where there's opportunities for leveraging, for working together, and, you know, not duplicating efforts. And I think that is just kind of a foundational thing that we've been trying to work on to make sure that the funding that we have really goes to things on the ground in a highly impactful way. And instead, you know, without that communication, without those partnerships and that coordination, not only within our agency or the USDA, but within other departments as well, you know, in addition to our state partners and also other folks across the country, you know, our tribal partners, all of that, it just requires a lot of communication and coordination that's ongoing.
Thanks, Vanessa. Todd, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Vanessa just said, and I think I would add you know, 3 words: leverage, like you said, collaboration, and also leveraging our collaboration, that is, with partners on the outside. So finding ways to, well, the 3rd word is going to be landscape scale conservation, which brings in partners and brings in our neighbors to look at it in a large scale. So really, is it a watershed that we have to look at? What is that scale we have to look at, that we're not these small little one-off projects, but more so we're looking in a combined effort. So how do we bring those combined efforts together? Where does that discussion have to be had? And yes, there might be a little bit of money here in this pot for invasive species, but how do we hook in with our, say for the Park Service, our facilities division directorate, and start talking about where are we building new structures or remodeling new structures or parking lots, what have you, infrastructure, and how are we thinking about invasive species? So there's money there. We have some money, putting those together, making sure that we're not spreading invasives when we're doing some of those disturbances. But that takes working cross channels, I guess.
Thanks, Todd. Dave, any other thoughts on this question?
Thank you. Yeah, I love what the panelists already said about this. Being on the funded side of the house rather than the funder side of the house. I totally agree with you, Vanessa. There's never enough resources to really tackle all of these things the way we'd like. And so I'm excited about the way I think a lot of partners are bringing the science together to help us identify the key priorities and be really strategic about what we're doing. And I think we've got so much good science from folks in this meeting and beyond that we're ready to put together some really good conservation strategies that bring invasive species into the picture. And one thing we're trying to do at our program is make those data easier to get to. So we stood up a web mapping reporting tool called Codex, and you can check that out on our website. The other programs, Kansas is standing up a similar thing. Wyoming and Montana have well-developed tools like this running as well that managers and decision makers can tap into to support those kind of decisions.
Thanks, Dave. Any other questions from the audience? Let's see, we have a hand up from Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll chime in again. I know we're running low on time with just a couple minutes left, but building on what was said about leveraging, and I know the title of the session is Funding Priorities and Policies, and I know the Forest Service spends about half of its budget on fire and wildland fire protection. So maybe it's a question to Vanessa, but maybe to the group too, because I know that Stosh and NISC is still running this invasive species fire task team. And this meeting is presumably folks kind of more in the invasive species domain and thinking about climate change than they are about the fire management. What would you say to the group to sort of watch for ways to leverage firefighting and fire management, wildland fire management activities to make sure that they're done in a way that respects kind of the risks of invasive and maybe even promotes kind of some of the more invasive species control that could leverage or partner off with some of that fire management work?
Yeah, Jeff, I think that's a great comment. You kind of addressed Forest Service, but also we in the Park Service do have a pretty active fire program, not as large as Forest Service, but this is a discussion that we have been entering into, and we've made some actions on. Spending monies on fuel reduction pre-fires, focusing on invasive species. At that point, and then also post fires. There are monies that are given for restoration efforts after fires move through. Many times those are limited and short term. So we're trying to focus on that longer term so that we don't, 1 year after just leave and go to a different spot, but monitor, continue to do actions in that post-fire realm. But bringing those two together, the wildfire groups and the invasive species veg resource management at the park, that's the key for us in the Park Service.
Thanks, Todd. We've got just one more minute, but I wanted to give Vanessa a chance to comment and then maybe hear from Stosh as well before we go to break.
Thanks. Actually, I think what Todd said hit it on the head, but I was going to offer, I think Stosh has been working on a lot of this, so I think he has some really good insights to contribute.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and Jeff, very good question. And obviously you're familiar with this when we initially started the discussions with the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. And I think there's two parts here. I mean, there's what Todd was talking about in terms of the existing programs and tools and how we do a better job of sort of collaborating across the community and developing the actionable science that can inform how the two communities cooperate. But there's also a leadership component, which we're very active in with the Wildland Fire Leadership Council in terms of where there's where it's necessary to get sort of direction from leadership to do this kind of integration if it's sort of outside of the existing frames of reference. So I think we're working, on those two fronts, recognizing in some cases there might be sort of a culture change in terms of looking at invasive species, maybe it's annual grass or invasive plant management in the context of vegetation management, but then pairing that with the tools that are already being sort of developed and applied on the landscape. So I think it's a twofold approach.
Thank you. Thanks again to all of our panelists. That was a great discussion.